something extraordinary just happened, and most people don't realize how quickly the world just shifted. Because for the first time in years, President Trump didn't hint at taking action, didn't float a trial balloon, didn't send a cryptic message through a late-night post. He issued a direct, unmistakable order. The airspace surrounding Venezuela is now closed. Completely. Immediately. And when a sitting president uses that kind of language, that's not symbolic. That's operational. That means assets are already in motion, it means decisions have been made, and it means something significant is about to unfold. Now, if you're like most folks watching this, you might be wondering, why Venezuela? Why now? And why in such a dramatic, high-stakes way? After all, we've seen presidents saber rattle before, we've heard tough talk, but closing an entire nation's airspace? That's a different level entirely. That's the kind of move you make when you're not just posturing, you're preparing. And that raises the big question we're going to answer today. What does this action really mean? Not just for Venezuela, not just for regional politics, but for every American sitting at home watching the news and wondering what comes next. By the time we're done here, you'll understand why experts are calling this one of the most consequential moves of Trump's presidency so far. You'll see how it connects to the drug crisis hitting communities across America, to the political battles raging inside the Republican Party, and to a broader strategic shift that's been building quietly for months. And more importantly, you'll understand what it means for you, for your safety, for your country's future, and for the world your grandchildren are going to inherit. So let's start with the announcement itself. On Truth Social, President Trump posted a message directed at airlines, pilots, drug dealers, and human traffickers. The language was blunt. Please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Now, to some people, that might sound like just another Trump proclamation. But if you've ever worked in logistics, aviation, or military operations, you know what that kind of statement actually signals. It's not a suggestion. It's not a warning shot. It's a declaration of control. And in geopolitical terms, when the United States tells the world that airspace is closed, it means we have the ability and the intent to enforce it. Think about what that requires. You can't just announce an airspace closure and hope people listen. You need radar coverage. You need aircraft on station fighters, surveillance planes, tankers to keep them fueled. You need command and control infrastructure in place, likely operating out of bases in Colombia, the Caribbean, maybe even ships at sea. And most importantly, you need the political will to follow through if someone challenges you. Because once you say this airspace is closed and a plane tests that boundary, you've got to be ready to back up your words. Otherwise, you lose credibility on the world stage faster than you can imagine. And here's the thing. The United States isn't bluffing. We know that because there's already a massive military presence in the region. The USS Gerald R. Ford, one of the most advanced aircraft carriers ever built, is currently positioned in Caribbean waters along with its entire strike group. Now, for those who might not be familiar, a carrier strike group isn't just one ship, it's a floating city of military power. You've got the carrier itself, carrying somewhere between 70 and 80 aircraft. You've got guided missile cruisers, destroyers with advanced radar and missile systems, submarines lurking beneath the surface, and supply ships keeping the whole operation running. And when you move that much firepower into a region, you're not doing it for appearances. You're doing it because you're preparing for a range of possible outcomes, and you want to be ready for all of them. So why does all this matter? Why should everyday Americans care about what's happening off the coast of Venezuela? Well, let me connect the dots for you. Because this isn't just about foreign policy in some distant country. This is about the single biggest threat to American families right now, the drug crisis. And Venezuela sits right at the heart of it. For years, Venezuela has functioned as a superhighway for drug traffickers. And for this video, we'll call it candies. Candies that get produced in Colombia and funneled through Venezuela's porous borders, loaded onto boats or planes, and shipped north toward the United States. The Venezuelan government, led by Nicolas Maduro, has not only turned a blind eye to this, they've actively participated in it. We're talking about a regime that profits from the drug trade, that provides safe harbor to cartel operatives, and that has essentially become a narco state. The numbers are staggering. Estimates suggest that somewhere between several hundred and many hundreds of tons of candies pass through Venezuela every single year, and much of those candies end up on American streets, where they're often laced with another candy, a synthetic opioid so deadly that an amount smaller than a few grains of salt can kill you. The result? Over the past couple of decades, we've lost well over 1 million Americans to drug overdoses. Think about that for a moment. In the span of roughly 25 years, more Americans have died from drug overdoses than we lost in every major war of the 20th century combined. It's a staggering, almost incomprehensible tragedy, and it's not slowing down. Every year, tens of thousands more families lose a son, a daughter, a parent, a friend. These aren't strangers in some abstract statistic. These are real people in real communities. And a huge portion of those deaths can be traced back to the drugs flowing through Venezuela. President Trump has said publicly that the administration has already stopped about 85% of drug shipments coming by sea. And if you've been paying attention to the news over the past few months, you've probably noticed that the Coast Guard and Navy have been extremely active in the Caribbean, interdicting boats, seizing cargo, and making arrests. That's real progress. But here's the problem. When you shut down one route, the traffickers adapt. They start using land routes, smaller aircraft, tunnels, whatever it takes. And that's exactly what Trump was referring to when he said, "We'll be starting to stop them by land also. The land is easier, but that's going to start very soon." Now, stopping drugs by land is a very different kind of operation than intercepting boats at sea. At sea, you're operating in international waters or well within U.S. jurisdiction. The rules of engagement are clear, but land operations, that's where things get complicated. Because if you're talking about striking drug labs, storage facilities, or cartel command centers inside Venezuela, that's not an interdiction, that's an incursion. And legally, politically, and militarily, that crosses a very significant line. It's essentially an act of war. And that brings us to the question everyone's asking. Is the United States actually preparing to launch strikes inside Venezuela? Well, according to reporting from major outlets, the Pentagon has presented the president with a range of options. These reportedly include targeting drug production facilities operated by Colombian cartels that use Venezuela as a base, hitting storage depots where candies are stockpiled before shipment, and potentially even striking Venezuelan military units that are known to facilitate or profit from the drug trade. Some of these targets are tied directly to Maduro's inner circle generals and officials who have turned the Venezuelan armed forces into a criminal enterprise. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. You're thinking about Iraq, you're thinking about Afghanistan, you're remembering the promises of quick victories that turned into decades-long quagmires, and you're wondering, are we really going to do this again? Are we going to send American forces into another messy, complicated foreign conflict with no clear exit strategy? And here's where I want to be really clear, because this situation is different in some very important ways. First, geography matters. Venezuela is not halfway around the world. It's in our hemisphere, just a few hours' flight from the southern United States. That means logistics are simpler, response times are faster, and we're not operating at the extreme end of a supply chain stretched across multiple continents. Second, we're not talking about nation building or regime change in the traditional sense, at least not primarily. The stated goal here is disruption of drug networks and elimination of cartel infrastructure. That's a much more focused, targetable mission than trying to reshape an entire society. And third, there's a strategic dimension here that goes way beyond drugs, because Venezuela isn't operating in a vacuum. It's deeply aligned with some of America's biggest adversaries, China, Russia, and Iran. Let's talk about that for a minute, because this is where the story gets even more significant. Over the past couple of decades, as the United States focused its attention on the Middle East, China has been quietly expanding its influence in Latin America, and Venezuela has become one of Beijing's most important footholds in the region. China is now Venezuela's largest trading partner. Chinese companies have invested billions in Venezuelan oil, infrastructure, and mining, and in return, Maduro's regime has given China a strategic presence right in America's backyard. Russia, too, has deepened its ties with Venezuela, sending military advisors, conducting joint exercises, and even reportedly establishing signals intelligence facilities that can monitor U.S. communications and military activity. For those of you who lived through the Cold War, this should sound very familiar. It's the same playbook the Soviet Union used when they tried to establish missile bases in Cuba back in the 1960s. The United States drew a red line then, and we're drawing one now. Because the Western Hemisphere, North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, is not just another region on the map. It's our sphere of influence. It's where our security begins. And if we allow hostile powers to establish themselves here, we lose the strategic advantage that geography has always provided us. And this brings us to what the administration is calling its hemispheric defense strategy. This is actually a pretty big shift in U.S. foreign policy, and it hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. For decades, American military and diplomatic resources have been focused outward on Europe, the Middle East, Asia. We've spent trillions of dollars and countless lives trying to stabilize regions that, frankly, have shown very little interest in stability. Meanwhile, our own neighborhood has been neglected. Countries in Central and South America have struggled with corruption, violence, and poverty, and we've largely stood by and watched. Or worse, we've let other powers step in and fill the vacuum. Trump's hemispheric defense strategy is designed to reverse that. The idea is simple. Instead of spending our resources trying to fix problems on the other side of the world, let's focus on securing and stabilizing our own region. Let's make sure that the countries closest to us are safe, prosperous, and aligned with American interests. Let's cut off the smuggling routes, dismantle the criminal networks, and push back against foreign adversaries who are trying to gain a foothold here. It's a strategy that makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider the direct threats Americans face from drug trafficking, illegal immigration, and transnational crime. But strategies are only as good as the willingness to execute them. And that's where the current situation in Venezuela becomes a test case. Because if the administration follows through on land-based strikes, if they actually disrupt cartel operations inside Venezuelan territory, that sends a very clear message to every other country in the region. The United States is back, we're serious, and we're not going to tolerate threats to our security emanating from this hemisphere. On the other hand, if they back down, if they issue warnings and then don't act, it signals weakness, and weakness invites more aggression, more risk-taking, and ultimately more danger. Now, while all of this is playing out on the international stage, there's also a political firestorm happening back home. And it centers around a Republican senator who's finding himself in very hot water, Lindsey Graham. You might be wondering, what does Lindsey Graham have to do with Venezuela? Well, the connection is immigration, and specifically the failure to properly vet people entering the United States. A few days ago, a jihadist terror attack took place in Washington, D.C. You've all seen it by now. The attacker was an Afghan national who'd been brought into the country during the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan back in 2021. And it turns out that Lindsey Graham was one of the loudest voices advocating for that mass relocation. At the time, he stood alongside Democrats and said things like, "These people will make great citizens over time. We have a moral obligation to them. This will be their new home." Well, General Michael Flynn, who knows a thing or two about national security, just publicly called him out. Flynn said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Senator Graham, you are a worthless human and no longer deserve to serve in the U.S. Senate." That's strong language, but Flynn's point is hard to argue with, because the reality is there was no meaningful vetting of those Afghan evacuees. It wasn't just inadequate, it was virtually impossible. Afghanistan doesn't have the kind of criminal record systems, biometric databases, or institutional infrastructure that would allow for proper background checks. So when over 80,000 people were brought into the United States in a matter of weeks, we had no idea who they really were. And now, we're seeing the consequences of that failure. This isn't just about one senator or one policy mistake. It's about a broader pattern of prioritizing optics and political talking points over the safety and security of the American people. And it's created a massive political vulnerability for Republicans who position themselves as the party of border security while simultaneously supporting policies that undermined it. The backlash has been swift and intense, and is putting pressure on Trump to take even more decisive action to prove that his administration won't repeat those mistakes. Which brings us back to Venezuela and to the timing of this whole operation. Because none of this is happening in a vacuum. The airspace closure wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was the culmination of weeks, maybe months, of preparation. The FAA issued warnings to pilots several weeks ago, telling them to exercise extreme caution near Venezuelan airspace. The Pentagon began moving military assets into the region back in August, gradually increasing the presence until we had one of the most powerful naval strike groups in the world positioned just off Venezuela's coast. And then, just a few days ago, Trump personally called Nicolas Maduro. Now, the details of that phone call are still somewhat unclear, but here's what we do know. Trump reportedly told Maduro, "This is your chance. Your one chance to exit from power, to step down." And apparently, Maduro refused. He rebuffed the offer, and that refusal is what set everything else in motion. Because once you extend that kind of ultimatum and it gets rejected, you've got to follow through. Otherwise, you lose all credibility. So the airspace closure came next. And based on everything we're seeing, the land strikes could be imminent, possibly within hours or days. So here's where we are right now. The United States has effectively declared a no-fly zone over Venezuela. We have overwhelming military force in the region. We've given Maduro a chance to step aside peacefully, and he's refused. We've made it clear that the drug trafficking supported by his regime is a direct threat to American lives. And we've tied all of this to a broader strategic effort to secure our hemisphere and push back against foreign adversaries trying to establish influence here. The stakes couldn't be higher, and that's exactly why we need to talk about what this means for you, for your family, for the country we all care about. Because geopolitics can feel abstract when you're hearing about carrier groups and airspace closures, but the implications are anything but abstract. They're immediate, they're tangible, and they're going to affect daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. Let's start with the most direct impact: border security and the drug crisis. If these operations succeed in disrupting the major trafficking corridors through Venezuela, we're talking about potentially cutting off a significant percentage of the candies flowing into American communities. Now, will it stop everything overnight? Of course not. The cartels are adaptive, they're resourceful, and they've been at this for decades. But when you take out major storage facilities, when you destroy production labs, when you make it exponentially more difficult and dangerous to operate in a previously safe territory, you force them to change their entire operational model. Routes get longer, costs go up, coordination becomes harder, and most importantly, the volume drops. And even a reduction of 20 or 30% in the drug supply means thousands of American lives saved every single year. That's not theoretical, that's real families who won't have to bury a child, real communities that won't be devastated by addiction. But there's a second layer here that's just as important: the message it sends about American resolve. For years now, our adversaries have been testing us, probing for weakness, seeing how far they can push before we push back. China has been expanding aggressively in the South China Sea, in Africa, and yes, in Latin America. Russia has been meddling in elections, conducting cyber attacks, and supporting hostile regimes. Iran has been funding terrorist proxies across the Middle East. And for the most part, they've done all of this with relatively little consequence. Sure, there have been sanctions, strongly worded statements, diplomatic protests, but actions, real, tangible consequences that make them think twice, those have been rare. Well, what's happening right now in Venezuela is different. This is the United States drawing a clear line and saying, not in our hemisphere. You can do what you want on the other side of the world, but this region, our region, is off limits, and if you cross that line, there will be consequences. That kind of clarity is incredibly important in international relations, because ambiguity invites miscalculation. When your adversaries aren't sure how you'll respond, they're more likely to take risks. But when they know with certainty that certain actions will trigger a strong response, they're much more likely to exercise restraint. Now, I know some folks are worried about escalation. They're thinking, what if this spirals into something bigger? What if Venezuela retaliates? Or what if Russia and China get involved? And those are legitimate concerns. But here's the thing, those concerns have to be balanced against the cost of inaction. Because doing nothing also has consequences. Doing nothing means the drug crisis continues unabated. Doing nothing means hostile powers become more entrenched in our hemisphere. Doing nothing means American credibility continues to erode. And ultimately, doing nothing makes conflict more likely down the road, not less, because weakness invites aggression. Think about it this way. If you've got a problem in your house, maybe it's a small leak in the roof, maybe it's some termites in the foundation, you can ignore it for a while. You can tell yourself it's not that bad, it'll probably be fine. Fixing it would be expensive and disruptive, but the longer you wait, the worse it gets. And eventually, what could have been a manageable repair becomes a catastrophic failure that costs 10 times as much and causes 10 times as much damage. The same principle applies in foreign policy. Problems that are addressed early, decisively, and with overwhelming force tend to get resolved quickly and with minimal long-term consequences. Problems that are allowed to fester tend to metastasize into something much worse. And here's where the Venezuela situation is actually quite different from Iraq and Afghanistan, the places that understandably make a lot of Americans nervous. In those cases, we went in without a clear, achievable objective. We said we were going to transform entire societies, build democracies from scratch, win hearts and minds. And those are incredibly difficult, maybe impossible goals. But disrupting cartel infrastructure, taking out drug labs and storage facilities, that's a concrete, achievable mission with a clear endpoint. You identify the targets, you hit them, you assess the damage, and you determine whether follow-up strikes are needed. You're not trying to occupy territory, you're not trying to govern, you're not trying to fundamentally change a culture. You're just eliminating specific threats. And that's something the U.S. military is exceptionally good at. Plus, there's the reality that most Venezuelans would probably welcome this action. Maduro's regime is deeply unpopular. The country has been devastated by economic collapse, hyperinflation, and political repression. Millions of Venezuelans have fled to neighboring countries, creating a refugee crisis across the region. And many of those who remain are living in desperate poverty, despite sitting on some of the largest oil reserves in the world. So if American strikes help weaken Maduro's grip on power, if they create space for a political transition, there's a decent chance the Venezuelan people would see that as a positive development, not an invasion. But let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger strategic picture, because this is about more than just one country or one operation. What we're witnessing right now is a fundamental shift in how the United States thinks about its role in the world. For decades, American foreign policy was built on the idea that we needed to be everywhere, all the time, managing every crisis and maintaining order in every region. We call it global leadership, but in practice, it often meant overextension, exhaustion, and spending enormous amounts of blood and treasure on problems that had very little to do with American security. The hemispheric defense strategy represents a different approach. It's saying, let's focus our resources where they matter most. Let's prioritize our own neighborhood, our own security, our own interests. Let's make sure that the countries closest to us are stable, prosperous, and aligned with us, not with Beijing or Moscow. And if that means taking a step back from some commitments on the other side of the world, so be it. Because you can't be strong everywhere if you're overextended everywhere. And here's the thing that a lot of people miss. This isn't isolationism. This isn't about withdrawing from the world or abandoning our allies. It's about setting priorities. It's about recognizing that American power, while substantial, is not infinite. And if we want to remain strong and secure in the long term, we have to make smart choices about where and how we deploy that power. Securing the Western Hemisphere, protecting American communities from drugs and crime, and countering hostile powers in our own backyard, those are smart priorities. They're the kind of priorities that make sense to everyday Americans because they can see the direct connection to their own safety and well-being. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because that's obviously the question on everyone's mind. If these land strikes go forward, and all indications suggest they will, what should we expect? In the short term, there's likely to be some volatility. Financial markets might react nervously, at least initially, because markets don't like uncertainty. Oil prices could spike temporarily, since Venezuela is an oil producer, and any conflict in the region tends to make energy traders jittery. There might be some heated rhetoric from Maduro, from his allies in Russia and China, maybe even some symbolic gestures, like expelling diplomats or imposing sanctions. But the reality is, none of those countries are in a position to meaningfully intervene. Russia is bogged down in its own conflicts and economic struggles. China, despite all its bluster, has no military capacity to project power into the Caribbean in any significant way. And Maduro's own military is poorly equipped, poorly trained, and likely not terribly loyal to him in the first place. But here's what I really want you to take away from all of this. We're living through a moment where multiple crises, the drug epidemic, the immigration debate, the rise of hostile foreign powers, the question of American credibility are all converging. And for the first time in a long time, we have an administration that's willing to take decisive action instead of just managing the problem. Now, you might not agree with every aspect of that action. You might think it's too aggressive, or not aggressive enough, or poorly timed. That's fair. These are complicated issues, and reasonable people can disagree. But what you can't deny is that this is a significant moment. This is a line being drawn. This is the United States saying, we're not going to keep letting our communities be poisoned. We're not going to keep tolerating hostile regimes in our own backyard. And we're not going to keep pretending that strongly worded statements are a substitute for action. And whether you're enthusiastic about it or cautiously supportive or deeply skeptical, it's worth paying attention. Because the decisions being made right now are going to shape the next chapter of American power, American security, and ultimately the kind of country your children and grandchildren inherit. And here's the other thing that's worth remembering. The world is not a static place. It's constantly changing, constantly evolving. New powers rise, old powers decline. Technologies change the nature of conflict and competition. And the countries that thrive in that environment are the ones that are willing to adapt, to take calculated risks, to act decisively when the moment demands it. The countries that fail are the ones that cling to old strategies that no longer work, that prioritize avoiding risk over achieving objectives, that confuse caution with wisdom. Right now, the United States is choosing to adapt, and we're choosing to send a clear message to the rest of the world about where we stand and what we're willing to do to defend our interests. Those are hard choices, but they're the right choices. So when you watch the news over the next few days and weeks, when you see the headlines about airstrikes and diplomatic tensions and military operations, remember what this is really about. It's about making your community safer from the drugs that have destroyed too many families. It's about ensuring that the Western Hemisphere remains a place where freedom and democracy can flourish, not a playground for authoritarian regimes and criminal cartels. And it's about preserving American strength and credibility so that we can continue to shape the world in ways that reflect our values and protect our interests. This isn't just another foreign policy story. This is a defining moment, and you're watching it unfold in real time. If you want to stay ahead of what happens next, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that like button so this message reaches more people who need to understand what's really happening and why it matters. And I genuinely want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Trump's action in Venezuela is the right move, or does it go too far? What are your thoughts on the balance between protecting American security and avoiding foreign entanglements? Drop your perspective below, because this conversation matters, and your voice is part of it. We'll keep following this story as it develops, breaking down the implications and helping you see past the headlines to the real strategic picture underneath. This is history being written, and it's being written in our hemisphere, in our time, for our future. Stay informed, stay engaged, and let's make sure we understand what's at stake